Well, you're all going to regret that response very shortly, but it's in the news, forecasting. Just this week in the Times, Dominic Raab was talking about how in forecasting you had to accept the irreducible core of uncertainty. There's one thing you can be certain about in any speech about the future: it will begin with how uncertain it all is. About that, you can be 100% certain. And in Dominic Raab's case, we can be also certain that he's going to, in fact, pillage these people, super forecasting people, 2019, and he bowdlerizes them to say that they avoided assumptions. It's wonderful to know that you can avoid assumptions, especially if you're in forecasting and you're Dominic Raab. I have no assumptions this afternoon, especially as it's the morning. But I just want to say that right now, although it's in the news, it's an entirely glib enterprise. You'll find the same with my talk this morning. But these are the kinds of books that make airport bookstores groan. The future is faster than you think. You see, you think you know a lot about the future, but I'm here to tell you that I'm ahead of the curve. And that's why you've got to pay me not some money because I'm faster. And of course, the future is, in this account, exponential, and in this co-author's account, it is, in fact, if you read it, utter gobbledygook. So it's with some trepidation that I introduce this subject of forecasting. I want to say that the book about super forecasters, which is an elite group of people identified by American intelligence services as people who are nearly always right. Somehow I failed to figure in this group. What that book begins with is, in fact, the statement, we're all forecasters. So you might care to discuss this in the discussion. Are we all forecasters now? Right? Is anybody able to forecast? Is there no profession, really, that we can look to? Because, in fact, what Tetlock and Gardner say is, you're all forecasters because you're all planning about next week's budget. You're planning about what to watch on TV tomorrow night. Therefore, you're a forecaster. Therefore, it's a fundamentally democratic enterprise. I want to suggest it's an elitist enterprise and a very iffy and wrong one, although not 110% wrong. It's less than 100% wrong, and I'll try and explain why I take that view. Now, we're going to do a little bit of history. Why do we do that? Because we want to remember an old rival of ours, John Maynard, and he said, I think very rightly, practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influence are usually the slaves of some defunct economist. And I think that's very true. We are all labouring under ideas of which we're in fact unaware, that have often been pioneered before, and we don't even know who the people are who pioneered them. And I'll be demonstrating that in some of the forecasting episodes that I go through. But just to go through the prehistory of forecasting, welcome to Europe, everybody. This is the world according to Herodotus. As my laser pointer shows me, this is Libya. We messed that up. Saudi Arabia, we like them not that much. Persia, don't like them much. India, we civilized. Please, let's have another cough. Just as I'm coming to the punchline. We civilized India, and so that's all fine. But in fact, it is in the east, in Mesopotamia actually, and then Greece and so on, that we find the first forecasters in the world, beginning with Cassandra, rather important, always right, never believed. I blame myself for this. But she really was one of the earliest ones. In fact, her curse from Zeus was that she would never be believed. So that was quite important. Then a little later, we have this figure. Anybody know who she is? Women are rather important in forecasting. Medusa. She's too pretty for Medusa. Very good. Yes, the Oracle at Delphi, here it is. Product of McAlpine, Costain, and various other building companies. But this is where it all happened. And you have these rather poor illustrations of the Pythia, that was the oracle, the lady who was the oracle, surrounded by priests and engaging in a number of drug-fueled remedies, from breathing in the bituminous limestone odor from around the temple. And I think what we can say about this is that the Delphic oracle, it could be interpreted either way. That was part of the whole ambiguity of it all. And in that respect, it reminds us of an important thing, that we as agents are part of creating the future. It isn't just given in tablets of stone as forecast. The Delphic oracle was very much a question of interpretation and what you did with the forecast, which is really important. Let's not forget that. So those were some of the early beginnings, and we also see, which Frank I think referred to, and Tim as well, Plato's Republic, about a future in which rule was very important. The rule of an elite, and the way in which children had to be taken away from their mums and handled in a eugenicist kind of way. That was a very imperious vision of the future, which was quite early. A very interesting one, which is often neglected in the prehistory of forecasting, is Vedic astronomy, in which a whole number of codicils to the Vedas, known as Vedanga, or one of them among the 8 Vedanga, is the Jyotisha, or astronomy, the universe, and all of that stuff. And we can see that thinking about the future, calculating the movements of the planets, calculating the sun and the moon and so on, from a very early period, and this characteristic of India, mathematics was important to the future in a way that it wasn't quite so vital to the Greeks. So the Indians brought that to us. Coming a little closer to the end of the prehistory, I think one thing we can learn from Leonardo, which has always been important to the forecasting, is what designers call embodiment. The ability to visualize or embody or model in a physical way the future was something that Leonardo was very good at. Here he is with his flying machine and a helicopter on the right. Here he is not actually modeling human anatomy, but in fact robots of the future. So I think the visual and design side of forecasting has always been important in terms of capturing our imagination. Now, when we're talking imagination, of course, Nostradamus, the French prophet, is one of the people who've comprehensively, over the years, both been believed in, been proved emphatically wrong, and has led to the disreputable reputation of forecasting. So that was important. And then finally, in the prehistory, what Tim has already referred to, the parson, the very moral man, Thomas Malthus, and again, paying great attention to arithmetic, to geometry, to the progression of productivity in agriculture, and the geometric increase in the human race. So if we sum up on the prehistory, we know a number of themes are quite important, in fact. Cassandra was the woman who prophesied the Trojan War. She was not believed. War, as we shall see, is very important to the history of forecasting. The key figures in the Delphic oracle were not so much the woman, but the priests. The priests had intelligence on what was happening in Greece, and it was they who sort of gave inflections to the predictions that were made by the Pythia. We've seen also with the Indians that space, although it wasn't conceived of space, but the cosmos, the universe, and the mathematics you needed to get underneath all of that were important. Rule was also critical to Thomas More, which was very far from the utopia that we thought he was going to write about. As I think Frank said, he was very much in terms of what kind of power should be exercised, and once again he had a eugenicist theme. And perhaps most importantly, Nostradamus pioneered the whole thing that we saw with the opening of my talk, sheer charlatanry in forecasting. You've got to know when you see it. There's a lot of it about, And it chiefly emanates from the Committee on Climate Change right now. But we'll come back to them. So that's the prehistory. Now, I just want to say that by the time we move along a bit, we see that the locus of forecasting moves from Mesopotamia and the biblical Middle East a little bit, and India and Greece and so on. It moves gradually towards Britain and then quite quickly towards America. At the same time, the nature of forecasts become more fatalistic. So if we look at modern forecasting today, we see once again Deloitte messing things up with the idea that an organization can somehow be exponential. I'm not quite sure what they mean by that. I don't think they know what they mean by that, but it sounds futuristic and it just might be a bestseller. Now, it's mathematics time, folks, now. This is a function that is linear. There we are. This one is a function that is polynomial. And this one, the green one, is the one that's exponential, because the exponent x is the critical factor there, and it multiplies those twos very fast. What do these three curves have in common, ladies and gentlemen? Anybody know? Sorry? Population? I'm sorry, I can't quite see that there. Population? No, it's got nothing to do with population. What? No, it's nothing to do with yes, sir.
They all represent a rate of increase.
Yeah, that's true. And can we go further than that?
Lines on a bit of paper.
Lines on a bit of paper, brilliant insight. No, the thing that they've all got in common, which is only meant, sorry? Common start place, that's very clever. Yeah, well, they've also got a common ending place, sir. It's infinity. They all end in infinity. Why do I tell you that? Because before we rush to say they're all so different, right? They are different, but not that different. And can we please get the maths right? Because nobody does. When they say exponential, what they usually mean is fast at the moment. Right? That's what the adjective means. So let's get straight about that. Now, one thing that's happened apart from the popularity of exponential is that we keep on getting forecasts of the end of the world and nobody goes back to check them. And that's one of the things that, well, because even though people still exist, they still don't go back to check them. And that's one of the things that the super forecasting book's very good about, which says that, you know, anybody can make a forecast, but can you test the forecast? Is it, you know, should we go back to them and find out how accurate they were? And of course, they're not accurate, especially when they're from this guy. So we need a very critical attitude to forecasting. We need also to see that spurious scientificity is the hallmark, and spurious what Tim referred to, numerology. The Treasury, you may remember, on the eve of Brexit, said that families in Britain would be £4,500 worse off because of Brexit in 2030. I had to tweet at the time, was it 4,490 or 4,510 that they had in mind for 2030, before the war in Ukraine, right? Before everything that's gone wrong since. So what we find is a great ability to fasten on that Indian mathematical tradition, indirectly of course, to establish some numbers, very precise numbers, and that gives you a spurious scientificity to your forecast, and it's really out there. But instead of scientificity, why don't we also take this man from the modern era? Everybody knows who his name is, Donald Tusk from Poland. And what did he say? Brexit could be the destruction not just of the EU, but of Western political civilization in its entirety. Not just a bit of Western civilization, you understand, the whole thing. And what it shows us is that there is a sensibility to modern forecasting given to sweeping generalizations, not just the scientific spurious scientificity that I referred to, but also an imminent and also imminent, as Tim would pronounce it, sense of risk and of danger. So if you sum it up, what's really happened in the past 25 years or so is a succession of panics which have had a strong health component to them, a strong climate change component, and of course the most worrying prediction of the future was the election of Donald Trump in 2017. And it goes on, and one of the recurring things that we see is that we get a fascist outbreak every so often in terms of what's going to happen, and that's pretty much what we've got at the moment. Descent on masks, fascism, racism in the very DNA and foundation of America, fascism. But there is a new development, and that is that the Taiwan foreign minister, the head of the CIA, and others have quoted the Chinese Communist Party leader Xi Jinping as believing that war will come in Taiwan in 1997. Actually, if you read the small print, it's Xi Jinping called on the armed forces of China to be ready to fight and win a war. He didn't say we're going to start the war in 1997, in 2027. That would be too much of a giveaway. So what we find is that the spurious scientificity that I talked about is really, really dominant in a way that it was a little bit with Ptolemy and so on, but not so much. Planet on Fire, War on Taiwan. And one thing that we might discuss is, as we're all growing older, maybe there's more people to fear death around in the world, right? If we were all teenagers, we were too fast to live, too young to die. We had a James Dean fate in front of us. Since we're all old, we fear the health thing more, even though we are healthier than ever before, and we fear death more, so that apocalyptic sensation that Tim was talking about is there. And as Norman was saying at the last session, AI is interpreted both as a great force for good, but also a great force for bad. So that allows us to add AI to the list of fascist things to come. I just want to say that the slightest acquaintance with the big IT forecasters, Gartner Group, will tell you that most new technologies have an enormous amount of hype. That's what it's called, the hype cycle. Then everybody gets a bit sad, like, driverless cars are not really happening. And then they kind of cheer up a bit because one or two are happening, not having a crash in San Francisco. And then after that, you can start reaping the benefits. So any cautious acquaintance with the Gartner hype cycle will tell you that, most of the forecasting that's happened has been in the trough and disillusionment after some inflated expectations. But, what it shows us is that we have to take our distance from any particular moment in time, not say that it's exponential, but rather assess it for the long term. That's very difficult. But the cycle itself shows that there's more to the world than just a future downward curve. The East also shows us what the future will be, and that's a new departure, a bit like Taiwan, a bit like the healthcare thing that I mentioned. This is what Hyundai hopes to be doing on the moon, mining and sending vehicles from Korea in 2027. And this is what Kia, also from Korea, is doing in terms of the design of its cars, if you please, in Italy right now. So although I haven't studied it, I would say that China, Korea, and always has been Japan, along actually with Russia, Asia will be Russia historically I meant, Asia will be an important center for forecasting in the future. All right. Excuse me. The thing that comes out of all of this is the very heavily fatalistic nature of forecasting today. And that's the main thing that I want to say in my talk is that we have to retain that sense of agency, which has been a theme in the conference. And at the same time, we have to do our own forecasting a bit better than the rest. We do have to build files on what we think are the important issues of tomorrow. All of you would do all of yourselves a great favour, as well as Spiked and the Academy of Ideas, by building some files of your own on Asia. That is the future. That is where innovation is happening. And it's probably where forecasting is going to be happening a lot more as well. All right, well, just getting back to the history now, some of this Tim has covered, but more in an eschatological way. Mine is more about forecasting. If you look at what happened in the late 19th century, which Tim was referring to, the optimism of Jules Verne, and here he is going 20,000 leagues under the sea, was very quickly supplanted by the pessimism and fears of Wells. And we're talking here not just about professional forecasting, we're also talking about the popular culture surrounding the future. So it's through no special love of science fiction that I mention these people. Actually, at a literary level, it's often very weak. But in terms of what popular culture thought about the future, these kinds of pessimistic accounts were pretty important. There it was, 1897, I think, the War of the Worlds being serialized there. There's a later Wells. And forebodings of war were really the main event until, in fact, Hiroshima, in forecasting. And a bestseller at the time, it led to the formation of Angel clubs, was Norman Angel's The Great Illusion, arguing that Germany and Britain would never go to war because they were too financially tied up with each other. As we now know, this was a rather foolish forecast. But it certainly demonstrated the extent to which fear of an impending war had become a mass popular pursuit, even though the outbreak of the First World War was a big surprise to lots of people. You can even see this premonition of war and struggle and fights and disasters in RUR from Karel Čapek. It's around 1920, the Czech writer with a lovely Russian cover there. So the overall feeling in the interwar period, as Tim was talking about, among the forecasting community was such as there was one, and there really wasn't one in the post-war sense. But in the science fiction realm and elsewhere, the overall sentiment was one of pessimism, and it was something that Gramsci himself fastened on in his famous quote that we can hope things will be better even though things look pretty disastrous. Now, does anybody from the left know who this man is? Our top economist Phil Mullen is in the audience and he's shaking his head. Anybody any good on Cyrillic? Kontradiev, yeah. Now, and Nikolai Kontradiev said that the world moved in long cycles of 50 years. And he was given a thorough drubbing, not by Frank Furedi, which is what I was expecting, but thankfully he isn't here this morning. Well, he's not in this session anyway. He's gone to Dune. What Trotsky said was, look, if you're talking 50-year cycles, even this is too deterministic for me, it's wars and revolutions that determine the really big changes in the world. I think that was right. And he also says this is still too deterministic, but he's again nearer the mark than Kontradiev, that 10-year cycles, which he doesn't associate particularly with business cycles, are to do with the rise and fall and succession of ideological processes. In other words, if we look at the outbreak of woke, for example, that's more a 10-year phenomenon than a 50-year phenomenon. It's more an internal phenomenon than it is as external as wars and revolutions, although it does come from America. And I think this was a pretty good riposte, still rather deterministic, but a pretty good riposte to Kontradiev's extremely deterministic doctrine of long waves. And the thing that Trotsky points to, which is useful for us, here he is on the cover of Time magazine, this forgotten figure, is that different stamps of forecasting, if you like, are marked by the period in which they are in. Very simple point. right? That the pessimism and the forebodings of war were brought on by real tendencies in that direction. And in a period of upbeat development, you get a different kind of forecasting. Well, we're still in the downbeat section, and this was important, as we know. Here's a very interesting thing for the science fiction buffs. There were these strange people called the technocrats in America. They had grey notepaper, grey suits, grey cars, and they thought that everything could be made more efficient through engineering. The efficiency impulse, ladies and gentlemen, which we know from the webs, the desire to rationalize everything with an elite in charge of technocrats and engineers, was not only the property of the webs in the run-up to the formation of the Labour Party in Clause 4, it was also the property of many American engineers. And interestingly enough, for the real buffs, you'll see that the editor is Hugo Gernsback, who is really the father of science fiction, showing the interlocking nature of science fiction, American engineers, and the technocratic impulse. Trotsky was very good again on what all of that meant. Here was the New York World's Fair of 1939 and the wonderful Futurama designed by Norman Bell Geddes of the M25 in a few years. And Trotsky said, well, this is all very well, this World Fair thing. I love the show. It's terrific. There's just one snag. If we consider it's called the world of tomorrow, we should really see 100 military airplanes over the World's Fair, because he was very confident that this was no guide to the future. So when we look at forebodings of war, we can see that there's a fairly consistent pattern in forecasting of moving from optimism to pessimism and being extremely nervous about military conflict to come. All right, well, the post-war period is really marked by the briefness and modesty of the optimism. Although Trotsky was right that a more upbeat period would lead to more upbeat forecasting, the phenomenon is fairly evanescent in the case of the post-war forecasters. The technocratic vision of foundation by Asimov, 45, was very quickly marred not by the forecasting of Orwell, he just reversed the numbers. He wrote in 48, made it 1984. But the fear of the future was not so much in the novel or anything, but already in the Cold War and in film noir, you're seeing a lot of the apprehensions, despite the fact that the Eisenhower economy is lifting off, you're still seeing a very dark side out there. And interestingly enough, it's in this period in 1956 that M. King Hubbard fathered the theory of peak oil. You can see he's a bit odd from that propeller haircut that he had. So already even in the 50s, and you can see it with Kitchen Sink and so on, dramas, that the unbounded optimism that we associate with the post-war boom was already in question a bit. Now there were real developments, especially in the favourite period of mine, 57 to 63, from Sputnik to the assassination of Kennedy. The developments in the integrated circuit, in machine learning, in transistors, in space, and all of those things, did impart to forecasting a very dynamic impulse. And this is the era when Arthur C Clarke was predicting the geostationary satellite and many other things that he actually got right. And very importantly, do try to read Gordon Moore in Electronics. You'll find a very interesting thing about this article about the future of IT. The word law does not appear in the article. Moore never talked about Moore's law. Right? That was something that empirically he noticed, how transistors were more crammable onto the same space for a lower amount of dollars, but he didn't use the word law, and therefore he cannot be accused of the fatalism that all our exponential friends leveraging Moore like to do. It was a brief period of optimism because by 1967 we could all be the prisoner, and By 1972, we had Donella Meadows had declared real limits to growth. It's often forgotten as well that just in the wake of that, the idea of not commuting anymore became very prevalent with the telecommunications transportation trade-off, a lovely alliteration there. And we also see, even though it was upbeat, as suited the upbeat era of the 80s, Alvin Toffler already anticipating the working from home trends in some ways by talking about prosumers. These were consumers who were producing in their electronic cottages. And the message from Toffler really, and Nilles, is something we're very familiar with now, especially after lockdown, which is don't leave home. Stay where you are. Do it by TV, do it remotely, do it electronic medicine, telemedicine, and all of these things. So we're coming towards a close. We're doing pretty well. Let me just say that one special task for us about forecasters is not to slag off the past for its poor forecasts. That is too easy a temptation, the temptation of historical cynicism. And it's well summed up in this quite good book, in fact, about all the silly mistakes that have been made, usually in the direction of optimism, by forecasters in the post-war boom. There's a review of this book on my website. Now, nearly every talk on forecasting begins with the fact that you can't do it, that only I can do it, that you're no good, and that all these people got it wrong. So this is the head of the US Patents Commission. This is the head of IBM. And this is the well-known Bill Gates. And there's just one snag with all of these quotations. Here they are, repeated again. And nearly every talk on the future begins with them making this mistake. You can be pretty certain that will happen. There's just one snag. None of them ever said any of this stuff, right? The head of the patents office never said, everything's already been invented, I'm out of a job. Why would he say that, right? IBM, Watson didn't say that. So what we see is the charlatanry that surrounds forecasting very out there. And it's all too easy to make fun of past forecasts. Let me give you a little lesson on this. Paleo Future, which is a super website, has all of these comic strips, which both adults and kids read at the back of American newspapers, and they were full of, the strip was called Closer Than You Think. Your house would be under glass, ho, ho, ho. The postman would arrive by flying backpack, ho, ho, ho. How wrong they were. But were they that wrong? Here we are with push-button education. We saw lots of that in the lockdown. Here they are with underwater mining. We're just beginning to see, I will predict here and now, there is going to be a big green discussion. It's already begun about the ability or not to sweep the seabed, to go mining in the seabed. There they were predicting this, ho, ho, ho. They weren't so wrong. They weren't so wrong about wall-to-wall TV either. And nor were they wrong about Ocado robot warehouses. And finally, they weren't wrong about tunneling machines, or what Elon Musk calls the Boring Company. These all happened. So it's all too easy to rush to the past and say, we can never predict anything about the future. Forecasters are always wrong. You can't do that. It's too uncertain, and so on. This is actually a repudiation of agency and a repudiation of any attempt to envisage a better world. So I want to say with two dots above the I or one, it's naive to think that boom time forecasts were just naive. All right, well, the current period you all know too much about. Let's not forget how it was prefaced by the whole idea of what I do now is going to determine the fate of future generations. That's a very long-standing idea. It's a third of a century old, pioneered by the Buffon 80s Icelandic Premier Gro Brundtland. And here's another very important idea before we come to today's fetishized forecasters. If you look at what she says here, if I can find it, there we go. Very important idea. Where are we? Well, anyway, it's gone. 16 trends to future fit your life. The idea is that you've got to future-proof yourself. Forecasting becomes individualized by the American forecasters, personified by Faith Popcorn. That wasn't her name, it was a Jewish name, but she made it Popcorn to make it more accessible. She is saying you've got to future-proof your life. In other words, the future is something that happens to you. It's not something that you make, something that happens to you, and you've just got to proof yourself against it. So in this fatalistic scenario, healthcare became much more important around 1999. Here we are, all going to die of mad cow disease, the EU scientists told us. And we have a revival with Ray Kurzweil of the idea of exponential growth. And it's quite astounding to me just how much Americans are transfixed by the idea of exponential. And he believes that in 2047, there will be this fusion of genetics, nanotechnology, and robotics, which he calls a singularity. At least he has the nerve to put a date on it. But it's all pretty much bound up with this idea of exponential growth. And we see it also in somebody who I was very surprised Sherelle favourably referenced, Eric Brynjolfsson, The Second Machine Age. Have a look at this, edited by Tim Black, on Spiked, about the lure of the exponential in the hands of Brynjolfsson and McAfee. Now, the guy who wrote The Singularity was going to publish a new book called The Singularity is Not Near, but Nearer. It's now been postponed until June next year, and I think it'll probably be, if I got it right, I think it's been postponed till the year after. So forecasters, not very good about making a book deadline. So what do we have now? Well, what we have now is Andrew Bailey having to re-examine his models, Christine Lagarde always being wrong about everything, like Andrew Bailey. It's a quite remarkable achievement by modern forecasters. You can tell what's going to happen in the future just by reversing their verdicts. And then here we have the Committee on Climate Change. This is the guy who's saying you must change your boiler right away, change your car right away. He's young, he's innocent, he's a prat, and his name is Chris Stark. And if you read their latest report, you will find that all the prognostications about electric cars do not consider the used car market in this country. Sales per year, 6 million. Sales of new cars, 1.7 million. Why do they not consider the larger figure? Because Chris Stark and Lord Deben have never been in a used car. It's as simple as that. Now anybody can say anything, and here are the two commentators in the Times recently about AI, and nobody will rush to attack them. And the latest thing, the dispute between the Meteorological Office and Nature as to whether the overturning of this meridional overturning circulation, whether that will go wrong in 2045 or will it be 2025. The Met Office has attacked Nature for being alarmist. Why is it wrong to be alarmist? Because that would put more people off the idea that climate change is the #1 issue of our time. So really that prophetic quote from which I began with, from Philip Tetlock, we are all forecasters, that has come, such is the corruption of forecasting today. I'm just on the last leg, Nico, if you'll just let me do this, then we're done on my verdict. Why should we be a little bit sympathetic despite all the mistakes in our avoidance of historical cynicism towards forecasting efforts? The answer is this, that even science fiction and other people like poets have been prescient about the future. If you look at what Sir Philip Sidney said about our green friends, really. It's an inspiration for us today. It wasn't a forecast, but nature, he said, her world is brazen, the poets only deliver a golden. And we can take inspiration from that. And he seemed to be imagining that there would be a whole bunch of naturists, let me rephrase that, naturalists or pro-nature people who would always denigrate human beings, and he was ahead of them. And the second example of prescience, very different, is the great silent movie about The Office in many ways, although it's much more than that, The Crowd. So we can sneer at the past and past efforts at forecasting, but it's wrong to do that because we can be inspired and learn from them even though they're often wrong. And the thing that we need to remember in all of this is that forecasting must have an element of agency about what we're going to do about things, not just an element of fatalism. What the modern left does is always accentuate the second part of Marx's famous dictum, never the first. We should emphasize the first. So to answer the questions that are asked in the manual that you've got for this conference, is there anything worth saving? Can we learn from, be inspired by the pitfalls of the past? Can we dream of the future without regurgitating the present? My answer is, it's not all a fool's errand. We can be inspired by the mistakes, and we should learn from them, and we should get an even better history of forecasting together. And we can try to rise above our times, not regurgitate the present, but do a decent forecast. To rule it out altogether, despite all the fatalism that today attends it, would be a mistake. We have to dream of the future, even though we'll make mistakes in that. So don't throw out the forecasting baby with the fatalistic bathwater. My time is up. The 5 o'clock shadow is upon me. Thank you so much, and please troll me.